From the moment I regained my senses, I knew I was inside a coffin. My breath was thick with dust. There wasn't enough room to raise my hands, and realizing this kick-started my body in a panic. I violently moved every muscle at once in an involuntary spasm. The coffin lid was upset by my knees and tumbled away. The roll of new air and the dim light of a blurry room worked to soothe me. Only then did the panic of the previous motions become conscious. Coffins tended to be underground. This one was sitting on an altar in what I gradually assessed to be a church. I still hadn't sat up yet, staring at the high ceilings and religious messages plastered on a close-by wall. I tried to remember why this was happening. Lying on my back on a hard surface made it easy. I had felt this same thing recently, lying on a slab of rock in the forest. Yes, that was it, the lizard bite. Helicopters, hospital, hopes and prayers. Hadn't seen my family for a long time before that. The coffin suggested it all went poorly after my memory cut out. True, it did. But turns out it went much worse for everyone else. I must have looked like a vampire, pale and well-dressed, as I dragged myself up enough to peer over the lip of the coffin. It was too difficult to hold my weight, so it was just for a second. I was in a large room filled with pews. Still thought it was a church. Nothing about it looked normal, though. Those pews were askew, some overturned. The door at the far end of the room was open, bright daylight outside. I didn't see anyone else there, but that was only because they were lying on the ground. The place had a stink, but I was thinking nothing of it at the time, being that I had woken up in a coffin. A certain stench seemed part and parcel. It was when I summoned the will to fully sit up that the nature of the scene was truly revealed. Amid the dishevelled ceremony hall were bodies, as lifeless as I had been a few minutes prior. They were arranged in no particular pattern and numbered 5. They helped, in that their repulsive sight overrode the process of waking up. I scrambled out of the coffin with hardly a thought and stood beside it, bracing myself against a cool plaster wall at the rear of the altar. The smell persisted. Nothing to hear and nothing moving. I knew that I needed to look at the bodies again. I wanted to see if it was my family. It wasn't possible to tell. They were mutilated, grey and decomposed. An expert might have been able to tell when they died from a glance. For me, the allure of fresh air and daylight at the end of the hall was in full control of my movements. Dust fell from my suit with my steps. I passed close to the bodies and endured an upwelling of that smell. Like a wind at my back, it pushed me out the door, through a small reception room full of more dull wooden coffins, and down some steps into the street. I say street. It was a country road. A burnt-out car was almost blocking the exit. I didn't recognize where I was at all. What was happening broadly revealed itself within seconds. A man in a black suit approached. He was unmistakably a zombie. How could I tell? Having just been looking at corpses, and having been one myself, the conclusion came naturally. This man was missing too much flesh to be alive, and his grasping, clawing gestures were less than welcoming. His voice came out as hisses and growls as I backed away. Having been primed to face such monsters my whole life, by a society heavily interested in killing their neighbours under extenuating circumstances, I slapped the zombie's hand away from me. Slapping was the best my groggy arms could offer. I landed more blows on the thing's head. It fell over quickly, hardly able to keep its balance between its irregular paces and my waving hands. I hit and kicked it, though it got back up, unhurried. It quickly fell again, then stayed there. The rasping ceased, and perhaps so did its unlife. That was that. Finally, I had a chance to look up at the sign above the building I had emerged from, a funeral home. A few houses flanked it, but otherwise I was on a thin, poorly maintained lane in the middle of the woods. Should have known my family would bring me somewhere unusual for the funeral. Thinking this, I decided I should look for them again, although the still silence of a world with one more corpse added by my stinging hands created a less than hopeful mood. Their car wasn't nearby. A few vehicles were, although they were in a severe state of disrepair. Rust was even setting in. How long had it been since everything fell apart? I found answers flitting around the same parking lot as I. Pieces of newspaper were adrift. One was a front page, warning of a deadly flu in bold lettering. It was dated 2 months after my incident with the lizard. Not knowing the current date, I couldn't say how long ago it was from the present. I was taken aback that I could have been out of action for more than 2 months, though. To me, the memories of the hospital were days past at the most. I had clearly been some mix of comatose and dead for a while. The question of how long I'd been lying on that forgotten altar in a sealed coffin likely had an equally unsettling answer. I gathered more pieces. Most were weathered. A few words could be made out, and one had a distinctive picture, a fiery mushroom cloud. On that warm morning in God knows where, things didn't seem that bad. I searched around the funeral home for a while. I tried the dumpster out back, hoping for some more old news. Just body bags, stacked neatly on top of each other. A few bore government labels, biohazard. There were symbols and codes. Didn't say anything about a flu, as far as I could tell. A search of the interior first brought an interesting sign of the times. All the other coffins on display were full of loose ammunition. Guns, that's what I needed, if the black-suited man outside had friends. He had many. Hadn't even scratched the surface. After pocketing the ammunition, I wandered the building in search of something to fire it with, and chanced upon a workshop, the source of the coffins, no doubt. A door there led to a cremation room, where I was quickly greeted by someone whose cremation had been cut short. A body crawled from the wide-open oven in the wall, reaching for me, its eyes yellow as if they'd captured the flames meant to devour them. I closed the door. Now my heart was starting to get violent. It was having a hard enough time just getting used to standing up. Nerves began to prickle. The onset of the apocalypse was filtering through to my conscious mind. The novelty of my second life could only keep my attention so far. I went outside. 2 of the locals, their blood-stained vests barely constraining their grey, rotting bodies, greeted me with growls and raised arms. My brain was fed up with it already. I looked around the road and found a decent chunk of lumber. Started to get into the swing of things. Without much thought, I beat the 2 men to the ground, then a little more, until they were quiet. With no delay, I returned to the cremation ovens. The burned man was standing right behind the door when I opened it, his hand having crumbled on the handle. He fell to the ground with a chunk of wood through his undercooked skull. "Okay, this is happening," I said aloud. My voice didn't sound like my own after its spell of disuse. I wasn't thinking very much about the general situation. It was survival instinct, I think. Some switch had activated, telling me that I needed to cling to that length of wood, find something useful to do with a suit pocket full of 9mm rounds, and perhaps then we could think about how screwed I was in a more broad sense. There was a ladder in the cremation room that led to the roof. I shot up it, ignoring the pain. On the roof was a tower, designed to look like a small church spire. It had a single boarded-up window. Peering in, I could see piles of boxes inside a small room behind it. The window was the only way in. I retrieved a rock and used it to bludgeon the planks blocking me like a caveman. It worked for the cavemen. They'd survived worse than this, I imagined, and it worked for me then. I got into a little dusty chamber filled with gunpowder canisters, more ammunition, food, miscellaneous household items. Everything but a gun. Still, it was evidence that others had been stuck in my situation before. Somewhere, I realized, they might still be. I wanted to call out, but didn't. The right decision. I looked around at the woods and the nearby houses. No answers. After patrolling the red-tiled rooftop, I found part of it had been hacked open. There was a room behind the broken tiles and rafters, more substantial than the last. I squeezed in. There were some construction supplies. The room still smelled of wood dust. There was a strange spot in the wall with a poorly fitted series of air vents, one on top of the other. It burst open the moment I approached. two fellows emerged from a secret attic. I wondered if they were the ones who ran the funeral home. They were as loud and aggressive as the rest, and followed me back out onto the roof. I beat them with my club, and watched them tumble down the sloped surface away to the concrete below. It wasn't at all difficult to put them down. Didn't know if it was killing them, but it stopped them, at least. Didn't think that much about it for the first few times I had to do this. Heading back into the attic room, I pushed through the vents those two gentlemen had emerged from. Behind them was another concealed room, this time more lived in. There were electric lights still on, clothes and plastic litter. I was right below the wooden eaves. At the back of the room, the cold stone of the exterior wall was exposed. Below this was a black metal box and some wooden pallets of empty pharmaceuticals. I wondered if the pair had owned the funeral home. The pair had certainly had some time alive to prepare themselves here. Nothing had gotten in before me, yet they were already turned. Was it an airborne infection? My own chances there in that stuffy room seemed slim. Again, I wasn't thinking so much about all this at first. I opened that metal box. Loose bullets and makeshift armor made from sports equipment. More interestingly, a gun. At first I thought it was a club, made from a length of metal pipe, but clearly it was meant to be a musket of sorts. Underneath it were paper cartridges, more than 50. Tearing one open revealed black powder and steel ball bearings. Looked like these two had some hobbies beyond cremations. There was a lever at the end of the pipe acting as a trigger. I pulled it a few times and saw it was to grind a pin against a fire starter rod meant for campfires. I knew roughly how a musket was meant to work. That fire starter could ignite the cartridge, blow it up, and with any luck those BBs would come out of the business end fast enough for the business in question. Had a chance to test it right away. I went back down into the funeral hall with this chilly weapon in hand, and a pudgy man in a wife-beater took offense to me. As he growled and shuffled, I pushed a cartridge down the barrel, using a rod clipped to the underside of the pipe. Rammed it once or twice, probably not enough, then quickly raised it to aim as the zombie approached. The trigger clinked, the charge fired. It didn't have the kick of a real gun, and was quieter. Probably not real gunpowder in all those paper packets. Still, inspecting the array of holes in the motionless zombie's head, I concluded that I'd improved my situation dramatically, thanks to the funeral brothers. The feeling of safety that came over me changed my mind about the situation quickly. With an almost professional outlook, I took a brief tour of the 3 houses adjacent to the funeral home in order to pilfer some food, with the help of an equally pilfered rucksack. Found a few cans of soup, half-empty condiment pots, and post-zombie uprising jars of poorly filtered rainwater. All 3 houses had been depleted or looted already. The locals had been living in the houses after the fall of civilization, for sure. Windows were boarded up, and there were signs of fighting everywhere. I had probably been beating and shooting those residents to death, maybe, earlier in the day. One more was still lurking, peering in at me through the front door of his old home. I opened the door and fired the musket. The phlegmy purr of undead respiration ceased. The whole weight of the situation was beginning to fall on me then, not to mention the intense fatigue being dead for a while leaves you with. I took all I had found back up to that shady tower atop the funeral home and crashed out. It was more exhaustion than fear at that point. Since I was, as far as I knew, already dead, this burst of lively action was a strange epilogue that was well within its rights to end at any time. There was no doubt in my mind that my awakening and the state of my fellow citizens was related. But I felt entirely human, normal, and could even still speak. Perhaps they felt fine at first too. Closing my eyes in the knowledge that I might become a monster before they opened again, I slumped against the cool bricks of the tower and hugged the barrel of the musket. I woke up hours later to a clap of thunder. I had borrowed a watch, and it was at about 10 PM. From the second my eyes opened, I knew I was in for another shock. Red light streamed in through the tower window. I climbed out of it onto the roof. The whole sky was hazy, bloody, and quite bright. The full moon shone behind it, looking red also. A kind of dim ball lightning occasionally flashed in that high mist, revealing that it extended as far as the eye could see. The clouds were black shadows above it. I wondered if it was a chemical, something to kill the zombies perhaps. No sign of any planes overhead, same as during the day. Had been no contrails either, the classic sign that something somewhere was going very wrong. I had more obvious signs at hand, though. Below me there was a racket. There were more zombies, that was for sure. I was familiar and already fed up with their heaving growls. They were banging on the walls and marauding psychotically about in the hall downstairs, by the sounds of it. I tried approaching the edges of the roof to see them. Saw a few here and there in the dark. The strange thing about it was that the other houses nearby were lifeless. All the noise was coming from below me. And when I walked from one end of the roof to the other, the noise seemed to follow along. I could listen to the zombies banging around in the workshop at one corner, or thudding against the lines of coffins back over at reception. In between, their echoing arrhythmic footsteps always seemed to approach. Indeed, they were after me. Even if I was alive thanks to the same infection as them, they weren't to be satisfied until I was fully incubating whatever strange parasite was pulling their nerve strings. Well, I thought it was better to stay on the roof. The clamour carried on for hours. I still felt weak, sleepy, and underfed. There came a point when my desire to be done with the danger and my desire to steer clear of it intersected. It was about 2 in the morning. The sky was still as red and ominous as before. I opened the hatch leading down to the cremation room and let my musket sweep around the place. It was empty, but zombie noise echoed from outside the door. I went down as the zombies started banging on said door well before they could have seen me. Superhuman hearing or smell, perhaps? These zombies must have come in from the woods just to find me. I at first thought I would simply put them out of their misery with the musket and go back to my spot. The door was half open from damage, so I stuck the musket through and decapitated a large fellow with a blast. But then a sly nurse with green skin pushed through the gaps in the door into the room. I fled, my tiredness forgotten, and I was quickly back up the ladder to the roof. It was not the safety I presumed. The nurse grabbed the rungs and started pulling herself up. I hurriedly shoved another cartridge into the musket, rammed it just once, and was lucky enough that it still fired when I pulled the trigger. The nurse's upper body had cleared the end of the ladder, but now fell back down it limply. That was enough. I closed the hatch and reloaded. There would be no doubt that these zombies were very aware of my location, even at great distance, and that they were not the same fiends I had sparred with earlier in the day. The red mist was the clue that night and day were different worlds. The noise from below was quieter than before after my slayings. I caught my breath, then returned to the ground floor. There was only one more reveller who ran towards me. I was lucky again that my musket fired, as I would have been tackled to the ground by its speed. I had my suspicions that the zombie effect was bacterial, as antibiotics packets were strewn around all the houses and even littered the streets. There had been a time when some medical fixes to the issue were attempted. It could have been that the bacteria were feeding off the night mist to energize their host. Probably, somewhere, there was a scrap of paper on a forgotten desk that would explain all this away with scientific precision. Didn't make a difference to me then, though, did it? I tried to sleep a little, with no luck. At about 5, I decided to make another round of the houses, seeking food. The red mist was thinning, and by 6 it seemed to disappear entirely. Perhaps it was just the light of dawn making it hard to notice. I did meet a zombie in a room I hadn't checked. It was dumb and helpless. There was no sign it had tried to leave to join the party during the night. Where had that pack come from? It was a sign perhaps that this remote outpost was near some kind of civilization. I hoped that it was, for want of nothing else than food. The houses only got me some stomach-turning canned vegetables after hours of searching. I collected a variety of household items and tools and stowed them into that metal box back in the funeral home attic. Then I stepped out and looked around from the roof again. Still just trees in all directions, no contrails above, no hiss of roads, plenty of birdsong. It was quite the afterlife, all things considered. I packed a few useful things in the rucksack and went out again. I found the narrow, dirty road that headed off east into the woods. With the musket in my hands and a small hatchet tucked into the pocket of a stolen leather duster, I began to walk.